your cable company keeps you on hold, you get angry. When you get angry, you go blow off steam. When you go blow off steam, accidents happen. When accidents happen, you get an eye patch. When you get an eye patch, people think you're tough. When people think you're tough, people want to see how tough. And when people want to see how tough, you wake up in a roadside ditch. Don't wake up in a roadside ditch. Get rid of cable.
Okay, so we'll get back to why I showed that DirecTV commercial at the beginning of this video. But this is section 3.1. It's the beginning of chapter 3. And we're going to talk about some of the logic involved that we're going to be using throughout certainly a lot of the first semester of this course. So the first thing you need to know about is some definitions here. Let's talk about first deductive structure. Deductive structure is basically the structure that this course is based upon. It's when you draw conclusions from previously assumed or proven statements. Now, throughout this book, we're going to prove a lot of different statements, different theorems, and we're also going to assume some theorems. And when we assume some theorems, that's what's called postulates. Okay, these are assumptions that we're going to tell you is true, and you're going to say, okay, it's true. Theorems are ones that we're going to go ahead and actually prove. Conditional statements are types of statements that you've probably used quite a bit in science classes. They are if-then statements, where the hypothesis is the if part, so if something, and then the conclusion that you draw is the part that comes after the then part of it. So, for example, let's write some of these sentences down here in if-then form. So the first statement here is all leap years have 366 days. So you would say if you have a leap year, then it has 366 days. Koala bears eat nothing but eucalyptus leaves. So if you have a koala bear, then it'll eat eucalyptus leaves. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. There are some tricky ones, like number 4, for example. If you notice, Smokey the Bear wouldn't have to do commercials for a living if money grew on trees. So the natural thing is usually kids kind of assume that this is the if part and that's the then part, but hopefully you can see here that the if part is actually there. So the if would be if money on trees, then the Smokey the Bear part would come after that. Okay, and we can go ahead and abbreviate the if-then using some different types of notation. If P then Q can be abbreviated as this, if P then Q. So this has the if and the then part as part of it. A lot of people will also use this as implies. So if the P implies Q. The converse of that is just going to be if I take the two statements and flip them. So if Q, then P. The inverse is going to be if not P, then not Q. So I'm going to negate the original statement for both parts, both the if part and the then part. And then the contrapositive is I'm going to flip them and I'm going to negate them. So if not Q, then not P. So let's do a quick example with these different types of statements. So the original statement, if I say, if you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois. And that's a true statement, right? So you can give it a truth value if you want. The converse would just be you just basically flip these two. So if Illinois, then you live in Chicago. True statement here, truth value is false. The inverse would be if you're not in Chicago, then you're not in Illinois. That's also, if you think about it, false. And then the contrapositive is going to be if you're not in Illinois, then you're not in Chicago, which is true. And what you're going to find is that the statement and the contrapositive, okay, if the statement's true, then the contrapositive is also true. And if you think about it, it's kind of weird here, but then if the converse is true, then the inverse has got to be true also. Because, and you don't really need to know this, but if you think about this, the inverse is the contrapositive of the converse. So if this was the original statement, then that would have been the contrapositive. Okay. I'm going to move on to the back side and try some problems on the back side. Okay, now I'm on the back side, and I'm towards the bottom of the back side, and I'm going to do something with what's called chain of reasoning. Chain of reasoning. And if you think about it, the DirecTV commercials, it's basically an example of a chain of reasoning. So their chain of reasoning was basically, if you have a bad cable company, then you'll end up getting angry. If you get angry, then you'll end up blowing off steam by playing racquetball. If you blow off steam, you're going to get an accident to your eye. Then you're going to end up with an eye patch. Then people will think you're tough and fight you. And then you're going to end up in a roadside ditch. And what the cable company is trying to convince you here is that if you start with a bad cable company, you're going to end up in a roadside ditch. That's the conclusion you can draw. So the if part is if bad cable company, the then part is the conclusion you can draw is you'll end up in a roadside ditch. Okay, so that's chain of reasoning, and the reasoning there isn't always valid. I mean, what ends up happening here is you end up with a bunch of things chained together, but some of these things are not true. Like, for example, if you blow off steam by playing racquetball, you won't always have an eye accident. So that's why this chain of reasoning doesn't necessarily work here. But if we use all true statements and chain them together, we will end up with a valid conclusion. So if I take a look at this thing here, I have these different statements which we are saying is true. If A is true, then B. If D is true, then C, not C, and so on and so forth. Now keep in mind that if A if A then B is the same thing as the contrapositive, right? We said that the contrapositive is also true, so not B then not A is also true. So we do need to use that sometimes. Okay, and one thing we have to figure out here is which statement do we want to start with and which one would we end up ending with. And what we're looking for here is we're looking for parts of it that are kind of by itself. So I see here that F's going to be by itself. There is no other F. And the other one looks like it's a D. It's by itself. So let's go ahead and start with the letter D. And let's say that if D, then not C. And hopefully you can see that if not C, then A. If A, then B. And then if B, then F. So the conclusion you can draw from this chain of reasoning is that if D, then F. It's like if bad cable company, then roadside ditch. Okay, you could have also ended up with not F, then not D. Both of these answers would be valid answers. Okay, and then let's try another one here. So, because this is the contrapositive, right? So with this one, it looks like M is by itself, and it looks like P is by itself. So let's go ahead and start with P, since it's already over here. So if P, then not Q. Okay, I don't have a not Q, but hopefully you can see that if not Q, then R is the contrapositive here. So I can use if not Q, then R, and then if R, then M. So the conclusion I can draw based off of this is if P, then M, which would have been the same as if not M, then not P. Both of those would be valid conclusions. Okay, and then we go ahead and we can try this with wordings. So let's try one of these. And let's try the first one here. If gremlins grow grapes, then elves eat earthworms, trolls, so on and so forth. Okay, so it looks like gremlins is kind of by itself, and it looks like wizards, it's by itself, right? Everything else repeats. So I would start with gremlins grow grapes, gives me elves eat earthworms. Elves, if I look at this statement down at the bottom here, I can use the contrapositive of this, elves eat earthworms, then not trolls tell tales, so not trolls tell tales, and then I can see here that if trolls don't tell tales, then wizards weave willows. So conclusion you can draw is that if gremlins grow grapes, then that means that wizards weave willows. And that's the conclusion you can draw. Okay, does that make sense? Hopefully that does for you, and we'll go ahead and let you go ahead and try some problems here. All right, take care.